Hello, Garland Nixon here, talking with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is our resident expert on all things intelligence, and intelligent also, I guess. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here. And as the usual things are going on, most Americans don't know that the U.S. has been running a dirty war against Venezuela for decades, terrorism, all kinds of things, as the U.S. does all over Latin America. And now, of course, Trump is sending destroyers up there, and they're going to ramp this up. What another regime change disaster on the horizon here. It's not like, another million war refugees won't show up on the southern border if this happens. So let's hope things work out well here and that this doesn't go down. But at any rate, we will continue to update you as we have information. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, he has a great website, and that website is called CovertActionMagazine.com. Hey, give everybody a little history on Covert Action Magazine before we get going, Jeremy.
Sure, yeah. Covert Action Magazine was founded in the late 70s by CIA whistleblower Philip Agee. And when it started, they had a naming names column to out CIA agents. They felt Agee felt the CIA was part of a criminal conspiracy, and they were operating in violation of U.S. and international law, and that it was his moral and legal obligation to identify the culprits of these crimes. And the magazine, has a throughout its duration, it exposed CIA operation and provided critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy and the political economy, the economic interest that often drove U.S. foreign policy intervention in these kind of dirty wars like you're describing now, in Venezuela. That's gone on for decades on Latin America, and it's usually, Venezuela has oil, and the oil companies that resented the nationalization policy of the socialists, and they own the political class in the United States. So
Yes. Somebody posted good news today. John Bolton raided by the FBI. I personally think that is a good thing. We don't know, where this thing is going. I hope all of the Russiagate people get prosecuted. And so I will certainly cheer for that. But, the system is doing what the system does. So it's going to continue to imperialism. The empire continues to imperialist is eyes, whatever you want to call it, do bad things. All right, we don't even need to make up words. All right, let's start here. Let's start with the usual ugly crap that we start with. And this is an article by Jeremy. And the article is, and this is important, U.S. military budget tops $1 trillion. Jeremy, you have some things in here about this. Some kind of details about it. So let's talk about this, abomination as homeless. Look, you know what they say? At the same time, they're like, we got to get these homeless people off the street. How? Oh, we'll just smash and mush and throw away the tents that they're living in. We'll throw them out of the city so they can still be homeless somewhere else, but we'll put $1 trillion into the war machine.
yeah, and there's a wonderful cartoon. It's a picture. I think it was Russian from the 1950s, and it shows, these fat cats at the military table are getting, steak and, treated amazingly and all the amenities. And then the other tables are starved, healthcare, education. They have all these other tables, and they're getting nothing. And the war machine is getting lavish with steaks, and that symbolizes what we see. I mean, what kind of government is that? As you say, I mean, you walk in American cities and you're inundated with homeless people. And why aren't there programs? I mean, it's a rich country. There's a lot of wealth And I've traveled in some very poor countries where there's not nearly as high a homeless population there is in the United States. So, I mean, these people need program. A lot of them, some have substance abuse. If there were programs to help them deal with their substance abuse, programs for job training, programs to help them get a place to live, I think 90% of those people could be off the streets within a month or two and could be successful in life with a little help. But there's no investment in programs, and that would be better for everybody. I mean, I think most of us don't like to walk in a city and see people in rags, around us in miserable shape. And that's just one thing. I mean, look at the U.S. education system. The teachers in the state I live, the teachers are abysmally paid. And as a journalist, I covered for a local magazine a teacher strike that occurred about 6 years ago. And actually, my daughter's school, a lot of the teachers were there in front of the Capitol, and they had signs. Well, some were saying, and these were in like rural areas of the state. Some of the teachers were showing pictures on their phone of their classroom had mold. There were high school teachers saying there were not enough chairs. We're trying to keep the students, get them to graduate, keep them in school, but they come to class and there's not enough chairs for them. They have to sit on the floor. There's not enough books. There's mold in the classroom. It's not a conducive environment to learning. And then a lot of these teachers, some I talked to at that protest, they had to have two or three jobs, and they work really hard. And they had to work at a restaurant at night. And they said, "Look, I'm exhausted. I work hard all day with the students. I mean, I enjoy it. I feel like I'm doing good for society, but then I have to go work at a restaurant at night, and I'm exhausted. I don't have time for leisure, and then they're saddled with huge debt. These teachers. So, I mean, what kind of system is that? I mean, these are dedicated people who are well educated, very intelligent, who want to do good for society. Train the next generation, build good citizens, and yet they're treated like I can't use the word on air.
Yeah.
And something has just gone terribly wrong in American life, and I mean, it's been skewed for a long, long time, but since 9/11, things have gone over the top. And this article, quotes a report like since 9/11, the military budget, which was already very, very high, because I showed my Clinton book, there was an opportunity. He had conservative figures, hawks from the Cold War, like Robert McNamara, saying, "Well, the Cold War is over now." McNamara actually testified before Congress. The Cold War is over, so let's finally use our resources to invest in education, healthcare. McNamara said that. But then came Bill Clinton, and he, hoodwinked liberals with this illusion of humanitarian intervention. We have to go and save the people of the Balkans from the evil Serbs who are committing genocide. So we have to send our military and, keep our military budgets high. And so that was a missed opportunity in the 90s. And then you have the war on terror was used to justify huge ramping up of military budgets. And the article cites a report from the Quincy Institute, which has all the data about how military spending has increased something like 30 to 40%, since 9/11. And the Trump budget, what he's doing, he's lowering taxes for the rich. He's cutting Medicaid and other, food stamps. And yet he's ramping up the military budget, and he's enacting this like Star Wars type program that's ridiculous. Some kind of missile defense shield that had failed in the 80s under Reagan. They never. It was too sophisticated technology, and it really had no purpose anyway, except just to kind of show off. But it's causing a spike in the national. I also quoted a congressional study found that the Trump plan will increase the U.S. deficit by like And the data numbers are in there.
3.4 trillion dollars.
Additional 4 billion. So this is supposed to be a conservative administration who's concerned about cost cutting and fiscal responsibility, and yet they're going to be increasing the debt by 3.4 billion. So
Trillion.
a trillion, yeah. So
Trillion.
trillion. So I mean, what kind of government is this that we have in the United States? That's I mean, this is and why I mean, why aren't there mass protests over this? I mean, I agree with protests over ICE, which has gone over the top, and it's really brutal what the ICE are doing. But there should be, big protests over this because this is it's just not right. It's not a way to spend our taxpayer money. It's a totally misgoverning our society. And the wars the money's gone into, Israel, Ukraine, have not benefited the American public in any way. That the Israel, it's hardly a war. It's just a slaughter of the Gazan population and Holocaust. And then, it's created hatred for Israel. And then Ukraine, I mean, the Russians have gained a lot of territory in Ukraine. So the U.S. has gained nothing except these corporations. This report, Profits of War, goes into all the war profiteering corporations, including increasingly big tech corporations that are, developing systems for the military. And the Palantir is a new big one that everybody, I think, is aware of now. And these guys are paying the politicians. I mean, our politicians are not independent actors. They're bought and sold. They're shills of these corporations, and they're not governing for the American people. So we need a revolution, a complete change in our governing structure. It's not working, and it's leading humanity in a very, very dangerous course. Genocidal holocausts. I mean, there have been terrible blowback effect within the United States. I mean, all the violence abroad blows back. Our culture, you turn on the TV and it's all murder shows and horror movies. And you have mass shootings have been a cancer in our society for the last generation. I mean, this is part of the blowback of this kind of public policy. So I hope people will mobilize for change.
Well, it's interesting because, and people are saying this in the chat, and we both know there's sound reason to believe this. We have people in the chat saying, "Oh, saying 9/11 was a U.S. Israeli inside intel job. October 7th was an inside job and a false flag in order to justify this stuff." Now, if you say that in the mainstream, you're called a crazy lunatic conspiracy theorist. If you look at the history of the U.S. and you look at the details around October 7th and the things that we've since found out about warnings haven't been given to the Israeli government, etc. If you look at 9/11 and all the things that we now know about that have been hidden and covered up in the 9/11 report and all of the various things that have happened, and some of the hijackers, so-called hijackers, having former connections with U.S. and British intelligence, it's not crazy to say the only way to justify this kind of mad spending is to do these kind of false flags. And the likelihood is that the 9/11s and October 7th and on and on and on, that there is an intelligence, there is some government actions that minimally contributed to them, if not planned and carried them out.
Absolutely, yeah, because this is not a rational policy. Nobody in their right mind would support this kind of skewed government policy. So they have to get the public to suspend rational judgment, and the only way to do that is through spectacular acts of violence and terrorist acts that make the public, think they're under attack. And to suspend rational judgment. It's called the strategy of tension. It's been used for a long time. It was used in European countries It's been used in third world countries, and increasingly it's been used here at home. And I did a study of the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s, which because I live in Oklahoma, and I was very naive. I didn't even think twice about it until I lived in Oklahoma, talked to people, started studying U.S. intelligence agencies. And then started looking into this, and met with a former Tulsa police officer who was hired by the FBI to do a study of the Oklahoma City bombing. And then his study, they were not happy with the conclusions, so they buried his study and forced his retirement. But the conclusion was, and the evidence was overwhelming as I looked into it. And there are several books written, but they just didn't get a lot of publicity. But they're very well researched books, and it was an interesting mix of conservatives, Oklahoma type conservatives, and there was a guy from the Berkeley Barb who started investigating this. And was out of the counterculture scene in California, and he saw something was amiss, and he published a book, Hoffman. And these studies made clear that that was an inside job, that the explosive, the bomb, the fertilizer bomb Timothy McVeigh had in the Ryder truck could not have caused the damage. Every scientist said that, and everybody said there were two explosions. And I met, in fact, a guy who lives near me, grew up there, and he said there are two explosions. Everybody who was near there said there were two explosions, not one, as they said. And it's clear that they planted military-grade explosives in the building. Then they destroyed the evidence. They set up Timothy McVeigh as a patsy. There's all signs of an intelligence operation. McVeigh was in the Army Special Forces and part of a special unit. And he actually, before he died, he told the story to his cellmate who wrote a book about it and explained what McVeigh told them. And of course, the trial, they made sure there was no trial, and he couldn't talk at the trial. But he was instructed exactly where to go, and I don't think he was guilty of any crime, really. They set him up to have that side bomb go off, but I don't think he willingly blew anything up. And they also created a persona of him as this white supremacist because they want to keep the public in fear, whether it's fear of right-wing groups, left-wing groups, Islamic terrorists. The key is to keep the public in fear and to suspend judgment and to support an escalation of the police military state. And the Oklahoma City bombing was a prelude to destruction of World Trade Center Tower 7, which was similarly a controlled demolition using military-grade weaponry planted within the building. 9/11, I don't know exactly what transpired there, but it's clearly there was foul play and insider manipulation because that it needed something spectacular. And you remember the climate. People weren't thinking rationally after 9/11. They just wanted blood. And, as a historian, I gained appreciation because I studied the Pearl Harbor incident, and it was the same thing. That was deliberately, they provoked the Japanese by cutting off the oil supply to Japan, arming the Chinese when Japan had invaded China. Now, I'm not saying Japan was right to have invaded China, but the U.S. had its own agenda because the Japanese was becoming a powerful country, Japan in the 30s, early 40s, to challenge Western empires. And the U.S. wanted to take over from the British and the French empires and control the natural resources of Southeast Asia. And Japan was developing its own power in the continent, so that had to be stopped. So they provoked the Japanese. And then they had advanced. They knew the attack was coming, but they deliberately allowed it to go forward and actually removed the ships. It was called the Vacant Sea. They removed the ships away, and then they deliberately. George Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff. He got the information early in the morning in Washington, which was still in the middle of the night in Hawaii, and he refused to pick up the scrambler phone. And he testified about this before an Army commission. They asked him, "Why didn't you pick up the scrambler phone? That would have alerted the Hawaiian naval commander. He could have activated his defenses and countered the Japanese planes that were coming to attack Pearl Harbor." And he said, "Well, the Germans might have got seen the cable," and that was his answer. And then the Army people who were grilled. This was a secret Army commission. It was declassified, but decades later, so historians could view this. But decades later, people kind of lose interest, and all the people are dead conveniently who
Well,
committed egregious crimes, or in this case, dereliction of duty, because Marshall's duty as the head of the Army is to protect American security, and he deliberately withheld information that resulted in the death of 3,000 Americans, at least, on Pearl Harbor. But that was also kind of false flag, because at that time you had the America First Committee. After World War One, the public said, "Well, we don't want it." Like 95% of the public polled said America should never get involved in another world war. And America First Committee was the largest anti-war organization in American history, so they had to have some spectacular incident. And things reversed right away. The day after Pearl Harbor, America First disbanded. Only one congressman voted against going to war, Jeanette Rankin, the first female congressman. And the public was whipped up into an anti-Japanese fervor because of this alleged surprise attack, but they hadn't been told that the attack could have easily been averted, and the U.S. had provoked it. Stimson, the war secretary, said the key is these. Documents came out years later. He said the key is to get them to make it seem like they fired the first shot in the war.
well, what's
So,
interesting
so there's a
too.
whole pattern.
Yeah.
9/11 is not an anomaly in American history. In a democracy, and our public and most people don't by nature want to go to war. I mean, even your worst enemy, most of us maybe they would want something bad to happen, but you don't want to kill him, let alone killing somebody all the way around the world, or putting your life at risk. So they've got to whip people up into a fervor and
Yeah.
stage attacks. So they're.
Even the Nazi war machine was built by the US and the UK, etc. They built the Nazi war machine to take out the Soviet Union. And then when it gets out of control, now they got to go and fight this monster that they built, that they finance. You know what I mean? That people don't know. Henry Ford had factories in Germany that were building things for the Nazi war machine. And when he was asked to use his factories to build things for the US war machine, he said he didn't want to do that. So I mean, you could go on and on about how the US has always been on both sides, profiting from both sides. And then of course, the Japanese, as you said, the Japanese were doing horrible things. It wasn't that the US really cared that the Japanese was doing horrible things. It was, hey, we want that section of the world, and they're taking that section of the world. But they couldn't tell Americans, hey, we're fighting over turf here. They had to say, oh, we're defending from, any way you look at it, we were never the good guys. One other thing I wanted to bring up, because we were talking about these false flags, and this is important in the context of the anthrax attacks. People forget that after 9/11, we had this weird anthrax attack thing go on. But when you looked at, we were told it's probably Saddam Hussein, right? And then we looked and we found out that the anthrax came from Fort Detrick in Maryland. And then they said this doctor from Fort Detrick is the one who did it. But they never really came out with why some doctor from Fort Detrick would just decide, I'm going to start mailing anthrax all over the place and killing members of Congress. And then he mysteriously committed suicide, like they do when they're involved in this kind of stuff. People forget about that false flag, which was even in a way, I would say, more blatant and obvious than 9/11.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's designed to suspend rational judgment. People are just in fear and terror. They think they're these foreign invaders out to murder Americans, and they'll support national security the way military interventions are justified, and that's been used. Relating to the article, these kind of incidents and the climate of fear and terror created by these incidents that were manufactured by elements in the U.S. government or deep state is what's used to get away with these huge military budgets and the skewing of government priorities. And it's really just a way to enrich certain corrupt elements and the arms industry and the homeland security industry. And a lot of millionaires and billionaires were created out of that. But I mean, the public suffers from a skewed public policy, unnecessary wars, and those wars have caused also millions of deaths. There were the torture at Guantanamo Bay, and just horrendous atrocities have resulted from these ghastly crimes that started them. And I think, yeah, October 7th is the same thing. I mean, where I was reading the other day something, and it was I think it was a news program, and you had an Israeli soldier who had lost his leg, but he said they were given orders. He was stationed right near the border on October 7th, and he said he received an order to stand down that morning, and like it took like 7 hours later, he was instructed to go somewhere. So
And
I
then
mean, it was a direct order to stand down. I mean, they could have been there within. And I saw another documentary by I forget his name. Jeff was the first name, Hanke, I think, and he interviewed Israeli soldiers, and they said the obvious thing that was the most heavily censored and fortified border in the world, and it would have taken less than 20 seconds to respond and to stop that Hamas attack. So obviously it was a false flag. And these were Israeli soldiers saying it, and there were all kind of other things that went
Well, how
on.
about this?
We can
The
discuss if you
Israelis,
want.
they were the ones that killed a lot of the people. A lot of
Mhm.
the cars were like burned and blown up. Well, Hamas had small arms. These were
Yeah,
like helicopters blowing up and killing Israelis. And then, so there couldn't be an investigation. The Israelis dug these big holes and pushed all the vehicles and things into these holes and basically hid all the evidence so nobody could look. And they said, "Oh, look at all these people that died." And you're like, "Well, you killed most of them." you know. And so, and there were also soldiers that said they were told to. Do you remember there was like these female tank operators who said they were given orders to shoot these at the, and they were like, well, wait a minute, there's all Israeli civilians in the house, and they said no, shoot the house with the tank and blow everybody up. So they were told to kill Israelis to make, of course, they wanted it to be the more dead, the better.
yeah,
And the other thing about interesting about 9/11 is within days after 9/11, the Patriot Act was introduced. That was like hundreds of 300, 400 pages. We're supposed to believe that that was written in a couple days. It was like they had the Patriot Act already. And so when 9/11 happened, they're like, okay, out with the Patriot Act, boom. And then this boom, pass it through in this fervor of mad imperialism and hey, I love America, wave some flags. And they named it the Patriot Act. We all have to be patriotic, right? And they passed that thing days after. And I'm like, I'm supposed to believe that this thing was written in the last 3 days. They had it waiting and staged.
absolutely. And yeah, when in my study of the Oklahoma City bombing, they also, within pretty quickly after that bombing, Clinton was able to sign legislation that previewed the Patriot Act. So that it's like a long process that they're getting from a democratic society to the police state we're now living under. And it's
Exactly.
these
And when
incidents that because they couldn't pass that legislation before the Oklahoma City bombing. They need some major incident, and then people suspend their judgment and throw away their liberties.
and they tried to use, oh, the Russians are doing this, and so we have to do this domestic terrorist act, censorship. They use Russiagate for censorship. They use COVID for all of that censorship. We've got domestic terrorists. Remember what they said about if people said, well, I have some questions about some of the things going on with COVID, and they said, you're killing people. That's terrorism. If you had questions about COVID, they literally said you're killing people, which means, oh well, they got to stop you from killing people, don't they? We're going to be
And I
able
would
to.
add that also the January 6th, there's a proven that there were provocateurs there,
Yeah,
and that was designed to make you fear the threat of right-wing extremism. And after January 6th, I did a study. They passed new legislation to bolster funding for the FBI, for the police forces, passing laws against protests. Uh,
the Capitol Police had a budget of like several, I don't know, maybe $100 million, something like that. Whatever. It wasn't a real super high budget. It wasn't much more than a lot of police departments and a lot of cities have. 2 billion. After the January 6th, they passed a $2 billion budget for the Capitol Police Department. $2 billion. Yeah, first of all, that money got laundered to hell. That's the other part of it. They pass these big budgets and they launder it all over the place. Now, another important article that you have that I did want to touch on before we go, because they won't let Americans know. And one of the things we were just talking about was um, in this new big beautiful bill, there's all this money to go to the quote Indo-Pacific Command, so they can now use various countries in the region as Ukraine 2.0s to go after China. U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan confronted with persistent protests. Well, you'll never see that in the news.
Yeah, and this has been going on for generations, and yeah, it's barely ever covered here. And that relates to what we're saying about Pearl Harbor. That was the purpose, so that the United States could establish itself. It established itself for the colonization of the Philippines in the late 19th, early 20th century, and Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific gave the pretext for the U.S. to establish a full-blown military empire in the Far East, and to establish dozens of military bases, which are still there in Japan and Okinawa, which the U.S. colonized directly from 1945 to 1972. And then you have the Korean War and the U.S. establishment of a proxy regime in South Korea with, I don't know the number, but a large number of military bases in South Korea. And the locals have not been too happy about these bases for generations. And this is a book I reviewed that's a very good book called Base Town, where the author attended various protests and just described the resentment in communities of the local population who live near military bases. And sometimes the protests tend to focus on things like just the noise from the base, the environmental impact, their incidents, sexual assault in the community of girls by U.S. soldiers. So often there may be an incident that triggers a protest, but there are repeated protests, and there have been for generations. And the book shows they used to be more political. There were strong left-wing movements in Japan and South Korea that were dedicated to trying to expel the U.S. Military from their country, and presented their governments as kind of adjuncts of U.S. imperialism. And not surprisingly, the CIA played an important role in destroying those left-wing movements through, like in South Korea, they created the Korean CIA that carried out repressive campaigns and arrests and disinformation campaigns, all kinds of dirty tricks to repress the left-wing movements that are not as vibrant at all in those countries, but there's still huge protests against these bases, and again, they're greatly resented among many in the population. And the argument is always, oh, well, we provide the security of the country, but these countries were able to have their own security for centuries. They didn't need the United States. And in fact, the Koreas should be unified. It was the United States that caused the artificial division of the Koreas that still persists, and that's a major source of instability for the region and potential conflict. And Japan existed as a country well before the United States was founded. It didn't need the United States for its security. So I find that argument just ridiculous. And it's a blatant imperialistic foreign policy and that's where all our money goes. And that's why we need an anti-imperialist movement. I've done other articles saying, you had the Anti-Imperialist League back in the late 19th, early 20th century. There was a movement, included some very prominent Americans like Mark Twain, some congressmen like Robert LaFollette, even former presidents like Grover Cleveland, who said America was founded as a republic, not an empire. And it's going to destroy American democracy. One of their arguments was that if you pursue an empire abroad, you'll destroy your own democracy. And that's exactly what's come to pass today.
Yeah, well, we got to run. I got to run. I got some things going on, but I certainly appreciate you taking out time out of your busy schedule. Everybody, don't forget, go to CovertActionMagazine.com for to keep up with the good work that Jeremy and Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov is doing. And they got a lot of stuff. If you want to look up 9/11, if you want to look up Ukraine, just look under the series tab and you'll find a lot of good stuff. This is always probably my favorite show of the week. This is my favorite show of the week. It's a blast. Everybody share this on all your social media platforms, and we are out.